their workers, don't disclose your status. Now, the reason for them saying this, don't disclose your status, to me, seems pretty obvious. It's a pretty obvious reason to me because it's hard for a union to come and say, don't get vaccinated. That won't be a good idea. You're not going to be, as a union, instructing your people to not get vaccinated. And to be fair to most of the unions, the vast majority of the unions are telling their workers, go get vaccinated. Go make sure you're safe out there. Go get your shot. What they are saying they are against is the mandate side of the vaccines. They don't want the mandatory vaccines. And their way to ensure that this mandatory side of the vaccines isn't what gets perpetrated against their employees, against their unionized workers, they're instructing their workers to not share their vaccination status. Here's the thing. The government cannot lock people out of their job without knowing their vaccination status. And what can happen with the public sector is something I was mentioning in some of the previous lives. One of the very interesting things with this entire issue, one of the very interesting things is that what I think the government basically would be depending on here is that enough of the public sector workers during this little bit of time, enough of those workers go out there and they get vaccinated so that the people left turning down the vaccine would be so small of a number that it would be irrelevant to what the government is trying to do. They have to make sure that the amount of people turning down the vaccine is a very small number. It cannot be over a certain amount that becomes difficult for the public service to run. That's one of the most important parts of it. So what the unions are instructing their workers on now is that regardless of if you go get vaccinated or not, maybe you should get vaccinated. Maybe that's a good idea. That's what the union is saying. But although you do get vaccinated, don't show them your vaccination status. All right, let's see exactly what the PSA says about it here. Don't disclose your status. PSA President cautions public servants amid government's vaccination policy. Newly appointed President of the Public Service Association, Leroy Battis, has advised public servants that they are under no legal obligation to disclose their vaccination status to their employers. But he also says that requiring workers to disclose confidential medical information is a breach of their privacy. He made these statements during his first news conference since being appointed. The quasi-safe zone policy requires all public servants to get vaccinated against COVID-19 or be furloughed without pay come mid-January. Government has said that those with medical conditions that prevent them from getting vaccinated will be exempted. However, Batiste questioned whether those workers would have to disclose their underlying medical conditions to their employers. And that's a good point. That's a very good point. Listen, if you are someone is saying that's the worst argument they came up with since, because upon vaccination it is recorded my vaccination status is on a government listing. Now here's the thing, here's the problem with that. That is true. Once you are vaccinated, you are already listed in most official government files. But here's the problem with that. You're living in Trinidad and Tobago. Now, are you sure that all those different various government agencies, the people who took your name down on this list, are you sure that they are now going to be sending that information to your employer? And now, here's another part of this. If your name and your information was taken as a result of due to health reasons because of getting vaccinated. You go to a vaccination center, they take your name, they say, okay, this is to record you have been vaccinated. Now, to give your name then from there to your employer, I'm not sure how legal such a thing would be. Even though your name is already listed there for health reasons, for them to take your name from there and give it to your employer may very well be a breach of your privacy. So I'm not sure that reason would stand. There's a reason that the government is instructing their workers to tell them about their vaccination status. If it was so simple that the government was able to find out everyone's vaccination status just from the records they have from the health centers, from whichever vaccination centers you went to, if it was that simple, then they wouldn't instruct people to input their vaccination status into the system. People showing their vaccination status to eat in a restaurant and to party, to leave the country. That's true. Some people are, but not everyone. And it's not a matter of what some people are doing. It's a matter of what they are willing to do and what you can force them to do. Yes, some people would be willing to get vaccinated and show that vaccination card in order to go into a bar. But if the case is that there are some people who aren't going into any bars because if they are not vaccinated, they won't be going into any safe zones. And if that is the case, do you think because there are some people who are willing to show their vaccination card to go into a bar and drink, that then you could force a worker to do the same thing? But legally, you cannot break a law and make it legal. I'm not sure exactly what that is in reference to, but that is true. Government has said that those with medical conditions would be exempted. He said no measures have been put in place to ensure confidentiality of this information. There's no guarantee that such reasons will be protected, he said, notwithstanding that the Data Protection Act 2204 is only partially proclaimed, meaning that certain sections of the Act have legal force at this time. The PSA reminds that the object of this Act is to ensure that protection is afforded to an individual's right to privacy and the right to maintain personal information as private and confidential. Give the Christmas tree some lights, folks, brighter than my future right now. The Christmas tree is lighting today because this is his last day up. It's January the 6th and the end of the Christmas season. So this is his last day. You know, he's going out with a sparkling bang. Of the 670,000 vaccinated, the government has a more than fair amount of persons which they are providing. Batiste added that the vaccination requirement is an attempt to unilaterally alter the terms and conditions of employment, which he said is against the law. It remains your God-given right to choose, he said, but he's called on the government to have meaningful consultation with the workers and unions and treat with the matter transparently. He said while Attorney General had sought legal advice from across the earth, the unions and their members were left to find out about the policy when they heard the announcement on television. And the next point he raised is that safe zones are not necessarily safe. But he's also questioned the meaning of a safe zone, as he noted that vaccination does not prevent a person from contracting or transmitting the virus, as we all know. So you can contract COVID in a safe zone, and you can transmit COVID in a safe zone. You can go into a safe zone without COVID, and you can come out of the safe zone with COVID. And the vaccine mandate for children to go to primary school and show your card or no school. I don't understand what that point is necessarily making. Both the government and the union is conflicted in law. All right. The point he is raising here is on the question of the safe zone itself. On the question of the safe zone itself, even by the very name, it's named a safe zone. And if you're saying that this policy, the intention of this policy, as an employer, you're the government, and you're saying that your intention with this policy is to increase the safe somehow allow this to happen, to somehow enact this. Attorney General preparing amendments to law to effect government's vaccination policy. Attorney General Faris Al-Rawi is preparing amendments to legislation to affect government's vaccination policy, which he will hand over to the Prime Minister and to the Cabinet. Blues Clues over on Instagram is saying people need to be mindful that my brother is not my enemy, it's the virus. Very good point. And some of the narratives that have been given out during this COVID pandemic have leaned into, oh my goodness, someone over on the YouTube is saying that they can't hear. How long has that been going on for that you cannot hear over on YouTube? Let me see if that is true. Can the YouTube live hear me? I don't understand why you can't hear me though, because my volume is on and I'm supposed to be streaming out there. Hold on one moment. I'm just checking on some technical difficulties. Also to bear in mind to all the viewers on Instagram and on TikTok, as per usual, the initial bit, the news bit of this live would be recorded on my YouTube channel, and you can feel free to go over there, subscribe to Nathan Springer, and you would be getting those lives. You could go and have a refresher on all of those lives and see the topics that we did cover already and go back over all of those news articles. Simple enough. All right. As I was saying, some of the narratives that have been built around this pandemic do seem to encourage too much friction, I think, between the general public. The enemy is the virus, and oftentimes what you're seeing your fellow man doing, they're just trying their best to survive as they see fit in this pandemic. They're just trying their best. Not everyone, but many people are just trying their best. And sometimes the solutions that they are suggesting aren't meant to kill more people. They aren't meant to harm you. They're just trying their best to find a solution in this entire thing. All this is trash. Don't change the current employees' terms. Change for the new intake. All right. So again, I'm asking over on YouTube, you all could leave some feedback how the volume is going over there. I'm not sure what is going on. All right. In a telephone interview with The Express yesterday, the Attorney General said it will ultimately be up to the Prime Minister, Dr. Keith Rowley, as to whether the policy will take effect by January 17th. What I can tell you is that since I last spoke to the nation just before Christmas, I have received useful recommendations, which I'm considering right now with the wider team, the Attorney General said. The Attorney General added he is in the process of updating his position to report to the Prime Minister and the Cabinet, who will take the decisions as to dates, steps, and processes. Questioned on when he expects to go to Parliament with the relevant legislative changes, the Attorney General said, I am working at full bar right now in the middle of the processes, and I'm working as per the deadlines provided to me. However, I have material updates that I will bring to the Prime Minister and to the Cabinet shortly, and then I will await their further instructions on the matter. Let me see if okay. Good. My YouTube is playing. I'm making sure. I was just making sure of something. Grand. So the Attorney General is saying that he is still in the process. He is still doing some recommendations. He has some tweaks that he's going at there, and he's now going to update the Prime Minister on those things. Question on when he expects to go to Parliament with the relevant legislative changes, the Attorney General said he's working at full bar. Al-Rawi said he also intends to respond to all correspondence from the unions. he disclosed that on a he disclosed that on Monday evening he received a letter from the Joint Trade Union Movement and that he is in the process of addressing a response to Mr. Roger's many questions. He said he also took note of Roger's statements outside the Attorney General's office yesterday. The Attorney General said he received recommendations from other stakeholders. He added that he met with the Health Ministry team and got clarification on certain issues arising out of recommendations he received so far. So he's saying that he's taking recommendations from many of the various stakeholders and he's taking it into consideration as he drafts this legislation. He says he's in the middle of a consultation exercise and he intends to return to stakeholders immediately. He's also navigating constitutional issues. Yesterday, newly appointed PSA president, we just read what the PSA president spoke about. He cited the Data Protection Act. However, Al-Rawi said he has not yet seen that PSA communication and he intends to provide a proper response. He noted, though, the recommendation that people not give their medical information under the Data Protection Act was something Roger also repeated. I look at that. The Data Protection Act is partially proclaimed and this would have to be looked at as the law as it presently stands. It's not only the Data Protection Act that you're looking at. There are other pieces of law that equally apply to circumstances where you may or may not be required to give your information. So the Attorney General is admitting here, he's saying it boldly, that there are legal issues that they would have to maneuver. And he understands this. There are some legal issues. You see, as I said before, there can be unconstitutional laws. There can be laws that go against the Constitution as it's outlined in our Constitution. That goes against the rights and recommendations of our own Constitution. And if you write a law as such, then the unions can go to the court and the court would strike it down as being an unconstitutional law. The Safe Zone Initiative would have forced private employers to ensure their employees are vaxxed. What's your view when the trade unions asked for employees to be paid to be vaxxed? Would you consider this as a proper representation by a union? I don't think paying people to be vaxxed is a good idea. In fact, I think paying people to be vaxxed is a horrible idea, because if you pay someone to be vaxxed now and then there are booster shots coming and then you're hoping that someone takes the booster shot, you're incentivizing the bad behavior. And if you pay someone to be vaxxed now, what is going to happen to all the other workers who voluntarily took the vaccine? Are you then going to have to pay them in hindsight? You understand what I'm saying? Now, on the other hand, as someone said in the chat there, on the other issue of standing liability, that one I cannot argue with. I just cannot see a logical argument against standing liability. If you're telling me that this thing is safe and secure and harmless and it's going to really help me with the virus and it poses nearly no risk, I am risk-free by taking this. The question to be asked, when is someone fully vaxxed? I'm risk-free by taking this. Then, in that case, it should be fair for me to ask that you take the liability for this. And if something negative happens to me by me taking this thing that you are forcing me to take, then I think it's only fair that you stand liability on it. And there's where I think part of the difference between convincing someone and forcing someone stands. If I convince you to do something, you cannot blame me for the consequences of that action. I have convinced you and you have your own volition. You decided of your own mind and mindset that I'm going to do this. Then, if I forced you to do it, then on the other hand, now I have to stand the consequences of this. I have to take responsibility for what I told you is going to happen by you doing this. So the liability question, I don't see how you could argue against the liability. I'm not sure how that would happen. However, the question of outright payment, and some of them spoke of this outright payment in order to be vaccinated, I don't think that makes sense. And some people were talking about getting some of their salary negotiations done, and the salary negotiations could be an incentive to get the vaccine. Even that, I'm not sure how well that would work, because there are many different people with outstanding salary negotiations, and are salary negotiations now going to be decided on vaccination status? So again, if you do that, the thing you'd have to worry about, and this is an issue from parenting. This is a parenting issue. This is an issue if you're looking after little children, if you're looking after young ones. You don't want to incentivize what you would consider as the bad behavior. Trini people can be too cunning where standing liability is concerned, in my opinion. However, the government says that you being vaxxed is voluntary, but they're going to say that they are not forcing you to do it. It's a choice. I think that's a play on words, and that's a dishonest play on words. You're saying you're not forcing someone to do something, but you're telling them if they don't do it, then they would be unemployed or they'd lose their salary. The options are very slim. The example I put to that is if I took a gun and I pointed it at your head and I told you, well, I'm not forcing you to give me your money. You have a choice here. You have a choice. You can do whatever you want, but there is a gun to your head, but yes, you have a choice. If I go to the court and when the judge asks me, did you commit a robbery? I would say no. I asked them kindly and I gave them the options and they had a choice. I didn't rob them. They chose of their own free will to give me the money. That would not work because it does not make sense. The threat I put against them is why they made the decision. So it wasn't really of their own free will. You threatened someone's livelihood during a pandemic when the price of goods, when we already know that inflation is skyrocketing, we have skyrocketing inflation, and you're threatening a large portion of people's income. You're not saying it's of their own free will. What makes a quasi-safe zone a safe zone? Yeah, it's a play on words. Again, you said it's a play on words, which in law you cannot make a law to break a law. It's a play on words. So I don't think that would stand. I think the argument for liability is a very good argument. The arguments for paying people to take it just don't make sense, in my opinion. What the Data Act, this is going back to what the Attorney General was saying. He was clearing up some things on the Data Act here. What the Data Act treats with is a very different construct. It is how the government manages the information that it receives. So some of the unions that are arguing for the Data Act and that the Data Act will be the protection for their information, I'm not sure if that would work, because as the Attorney General is saying, I haven't read the entirety of the Data Act and I'm not up to date with the familiarity. I'm not up to date familiar with what exactly goes on with the Data Act. But from my recollection, the Data Act wasn't really about you not giving information to the government. It had to do with if the government collected information on you, or if the government had to collect information on you, how the government treats with that information. So the Data Act, the point of the Data Act might actually work for the previous thing we were talking about. If you gave your records, you went to a vaccination center and you got vaccinated and they took your information there, I think the Data Act may more likely pertain to whether they can then take your information from a healthcare center, from a vaccination center, and give it to your employer. That may be where the Data Act actually has more pertinence, not in them taking your information in and of itself. In respect, now this is where the Attorney General gets very clear with their approach. In respect of the approach, we are clearly discussing an amendment to the law, an amendment to the Public Health Ordinance, which is now an act, and the law that we are discussing will take care of the issues that have been raised, including that which was raised by the Public Services Association. Why? Because there is a paramountcy of the law over contracts. That is the point the Attorney General is making. And as I said before, I've been saying this for a while because it seemed pretty clear to me that this was their intention. Their intention isn't to go and fight up with the labor unions on whether their on whether they could change the contract or not. They aren't going to fight up with that. That's not their intention on changing contracts and changing terms and services. So even if the labor unions are fighting this, very likely this isn't going to have anything to do with the industrial court, because what the government is saying through the Attorney General is they have no intention of dealing with contracts. They have intention of dealing with the laws over which all of the contracts must fall. To quote the Attorney General, why? Because there is paramountcy of the law over contracts. So, what the challenge the Attorney General has now, and this is a challenge for him being a good attorney and being a good decipherer of the law and the Constitution. Well, obviously it won't be him alone. It would be him and his team, whoever is in that team. They would be trying to cut a narrow path where they could fit in between what may be considered as some people's rights, between contract changes, and between the limitations that they can do without that special majority. So they're threading a thin line. And I am very interested to read the wording of whatever law, whatever amendment comes out of this. That is going to be interesting. And I can promise you that all of the greatest law minds in the country, whenever this drops, this piece of amendment, this piece of law, whenever it drops, they're going to try to pick this apart. So the Attorney General is right now trying to make sure. You could imagine that he is writing there, and with words, he's trying to cover all loopholes there. Cut this loophole, cut that loophole. Make sure that they're under the jurisdiction of the Constitution. You're not infringing on anyone's rights. Because remember, we're no longer in that state of emergency. You can't just infringe on people's rights. If they can change that law for work, what else can it extend to afterwards? Interesting how still the greatest in law is at this time. If they can, and that's the argument. That's an argument. If they can change that, what would they be able to change? And that's how they're threading very carefully here. I'm very interested to see how the letter of this law, what they're actually going to write there, the words that are actually going to be put in there, what it's going to be. That's going to be very interesting to me, to see how exactly they maneuver this to stay within the law, to stay outside of transgressing against the industrial court and against workers' contracts. That's going to be quite a case. Can we explore what will or may be their scientifically based and supported merits for this new law? I don't know. The thing is, that's part of the questions that the unions have been asking. Here's the thing. As a government, on a governmental perspective, the government of Trinidad and Tobago has good reason for saying, at least with the data they are providing so far, they have good reason for saying that they would like everyone in the country vaccinated. The reason they have for saying that is that currently our hospital system seems to be overwhelmed. There are too many sick people in the hospital system. And if they can show that inside of the hospital system, the vast majority of people who are sick and dying are unvaccinated, from a governmental perspective, they can say that we would like all people in the country vaccinated. It would decrease the strain on the healthcare system. However, from an employer's perspective, how would you make that argument? From an employer's perspective, you can't argue that from an employer's perspective, I'm trying to decrease the strain on the healthcare system of the entire country. That doesn't add up from an employer's perspective. That doesn't make sense. You're not called to ensure that the healthcare system of the entire country runs well. If you think about that, if you think about it, if you're saying that as an employer, I can now decide that I am going to make sure everyone in my employ is healthy enough to not strain the healthcare system, then your employer could then have mandates on what you eat, on how much water you drink, on whether you drink alcohol or smoke, You understand? There could be mandates in that direction. If you're saying that your employer now can see whether you should be healthy or not, that cannot be an argument coming from an employer's perspective. The argument coming from an employer, can we talk about how we have so much opportunities to export goods and we don't? Hey, we're getting to that. Don't worry, we'll speak something. A very interesting story about that came up. But from an employer's perspective, the reasoning an employer would have to use is that I don't want my place of employment, I don't want my job site itself to become more unsafe. And as an employer, that is within the remit of my responsibilities. I could say that I am justifiably responsible for trying to ensure my place of employment is as safe and secure and healthy for other people as possible. But how do you then extrapolate that argument from trying to ensure a safe workplace into vaccination? Because if all of my workers are vaccinated, would that then make my place of employment safer? And how would it do that? The government also holds the position of employer. Doesn't that in itself present a conflict? But the public service employer is the government. Where does the health policy of the employer cater for the health aspect of the employeeship? That's the thing. The government holds joint responsibility here. But the government cannot take that joint responsibility here and say that they're acting as the government looking out for the healthcare system and use that logic to make rules as an employer. The laws that would govern them as an employer are written and separate from the laws that may govern them as the governing body of an entire nation. I don't think that logic would stand up in court, because you have to think about precedents. The government as an employer, if you're saying that the government can do this as an employer, you're leaving the grounds open for another employer to do likewise. So I'm not sure there could be a logical argument for that. In terms of the safety on the job site, some people have been saying this, but we are seeing now, especially with Omicron, we are seeing now that the infection rate of vaccinated to unvaccinated is negligible. There's barely any difference in people getting the virus and spreading the virus. So if an unvaccinated or vaccinated person can equally get and spread the virus, then it's hard for you to argue that by ensuring everyone in your job place is vaccinated, it's increasing the safety for others entering the job site. That's a hard argument. I don't think it would stand up to logic. So that was one of the questions. That was one of the questions, to be fair to the unions. They raised that question also. And it's a fair enough question. I guess that would also have to be answered by the Attorney General's law. He would have to fit that into his law. So Nathan, if you say the government is lawmaker and employer, how do they separate themselves? They separate themselves by the Constitution. And if they make a law that is unconstitutional, someone can take it to the court system. Remember how our country is intended to run. The court system is supposed to run independent of the government. So although the government can make laws, there has already been a constitution that has already been determined. And if the government makes a law that infringes too much on the rights of an individual, you can take that government to court. And if the court rules on something, the government then has to draw back from its position. Now, here's a prime example of that. We saw an example of that. What was that? 2 years ago, 3 years ago? I don't know how many of you. I think many of you would recall this. Many of you may recall the situation where someone took the government to court because they saw it as being unconstitutional, that the government had in place a law that prevented buggery. Yes, that's what I said. In Trinidad and Tobago, we previously had a law outlawing buggery. I think we know. Yes, I had to take a sip for that one. I think we know what buggery is. But what it effectively did was outlawed homosexuality generally in the entire country. You could not bugger someone. It was illegal for you to do that. So Someone in the country, and the strange thing about this, the person who did this, I believe, was an original English resident. I can't remember the exact details of the story, but I'm not sure he was always a Trinidadian. And he took the government to court. And in the courts, he got this law struck down because it was seen that this law was infringing on some people's rights. So, if a law is made that is seen as infringing on people's rights, you can take it to court and possibly get it struck down. And there's prime example for that because now we know how that ended. So there's prime examples of that. There are prime examples of that happening. It can happen. But as I was saying, one of the difficulties the government is facing is that they have to create this law in a situation, but it's a policy that's being rolled out. The government cannot just make policies and roll out policies. That's just not how a country functions. Dr. Rowley cannot stand there and just say something and make every citizen in the country do it. That's a monarchy. That's an empire. Democracies don't generally run so. There's a rule of law. And the general rule of a democracy is everyone is under the law. So they must function within the law. So they can't just randomly roll out policy. It must be within the law. Was it struck down or did he get to challenge it in the Privy Council? I believe he went straight to the Privy Council, but it can be struck down there. That's the thing. There are unconstitutional laws that if it cannot stand up to the court system, they would have some difficulty. But as I was saying, the difficulty that they're facing also is that they do not have the support. They do not have the support of the opposition. The opposition has made it clear they do not support the government in this stance. And if you do not have the support of the opposition, it would be very difficult to get certain kinds of laws passed. But from what the Attorney General said, he has already noted that they know they don't have that support and they're not banking on that support. The dependence that they're having isn't based on the support of the opposition. They don't need that support to get their law passed. Their intention is to pass it within the remit of the Public Health Ordinance. And once they do that, if it stands up, it would be above everything else. That's the intention. I think the government feels that persons are unaware, so they can try fear-mongering. Next move is the fully vaxxed would need to be boosted or furloughed. Workers are doing so unwillingly. All right, let's go over to Tobago. Tobago is having some difficulties. I watched a video of it over the weekend. I watched some videos from Tobago and Tobago is seeing some problems. They had a New Year's party in Tobago and it seemed like no one cared. It seemed like no one cared about the rules. They just did whatever they wanted to do. The Attorney General has one escape law to use and that is Redundancy Act. The poor health secretary over in Tobago is starting to plead. And part of the difficulty they would be facing is they arose to power. The present Tobago leadership came into power as a more populist style of governance. They are what the people wanted. They go according to what the people say and what the people want. And if the people want to lime, if you're the populist candidate, it may be a bit more difficult to hedge in these people. Some of what has been said from their very own platform may have encouraged some of this behavior. And then you have the reality where the political leader of the PDP is a known anti-vaxxer. Faith. Let's pull up this article. Yes. Faith, this can't be Tobago. Hundreds attend New Year's zest. Tobago House of Assembly Health Secretary Dr. Faith B. Israel is disappointed by hundreds of Tobagonians who decided to attend a zest lime on New Year's Day during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. She was saying, well, I saw the video of the zesta party and I thought to myself, This cannot be Tobago in the height of a pandemic. The reality is our actions have consequences. Those consequences include us getting sick, overwhelming the healthcare system, and unfortunately, those consequences include our friends and families getting very sick and dying. She said many of these young people are now returning to their homes and infecting their family members. And that's the sad reality of a lot of this. The reality from the very beginning was, well, imagine being an anti-vaxxer in 2022. The reality from the very beginning was that the younger people stood much less of a risk. And if you have it that these young people are maneuvering freely, they're spreading this virus, and then they're carrying it back home to more at-risk people. You could have the case where these young people who get the virus initially, who do whatever deeds they do that open them up to getting this virus, they get it, they live, but then they give it to someone who cannot live with this virus. Should hold a COVID vet after the pandemic call COVID nothing. I am kind of just the COVID to add to the numbers. Someone says, imagine being an anti-vaxxer in 2022. Now, bear in mind, the definition for anti-vaxxer now includes people who are against vaccine mandates. Personally, I am against vaccine mandates. So, by the dictionary definition of anti-vaxxer, I myself am an anti-vaxxer. By the dictionary definition. Now, it's funny because I am a fully vaxxed anti-vaxxer. It's the strange situation we find ourselves in now. Someone could be in support of vaccines, but because they don't support the mandate of vaccines, the definition now has you as an anti-vaxxer. There's no reason to be an anti-vaxxer. I don't see the logic in it. I'm 16 and I don't know how adults think. Or this particular mandate. I'm against general vaccine mandates. I am against this particular one, the way they're trying to outline it. And personally, I'm kind of against even the ones in schools, to be very honest. I'm not against it for the school itself. I think a school could determine if someone has to be vaccinated to enter their premises. They could write that on the entry letter and fine. But I don't think a school should be able to, at a whim, change which vaccine is necessary. I don't think so. So by me not agreeing with all vaccine mandates, so there may be some vaccine mandates in some situations I'm fully in agreement with, but in certain situations I'm just not in agreement with it. And by that definition, by not being in agreement with a mandate, then I'm also an anti-vaxxer in some situations. Too many sad stories of families dying. There's no end. I feel like the faster we're vaccinated, the better, and you're not forced. There's no end to the amount of sad stories coming out of this. And that's what makes having discussions about this entire thing such a difficult thing also, because the reality is, as I keep saying, I regularly say this on many of the lives, the reality is people are dying. People are dying. And when people are dying, having some clear discussions about it could be difficult because emotions would be heightened. So as someone says there, they're for the mandates because they believe everyone should get vaccinated. The faster we do it, the better. I actually believe more people should be vaccinated. I don't think necessarily everyone. I don't think that may necessarily be a necessity in this specific case. Maybe not everyone, because some people who got it previously, maybe they don't need being vaccinated. But particularly people of a certain age, particularly so many people with their pre-existing conditions who are at risk, you really should be vaccinated. When I see some people who are anti-vaxxers and you could see how their obvious health looks, it doesn't seem like a logical choice. The health system overwhelmed, but to me, it always has been new structure needed. How much will be enough? Because as of 1, none, 2 shots, vax people should, right? All right. we would all be dead from Spanish flu if it hit nowadays. Someone in the chat is saying that, and I've seen some arguments about this. Now, here's this idea. I've seen some people say this, and I think it's true. I think if COVID-19 was very deadly, wow, my Instagram live just decided to go kaput. That's very strange. So if you're on YouTube, you would be hearing me, but you won't be seeing me. I'm just trying to get back onto my Instagram live. Instagram is really the fight down. All right, okay. So to go on speaking while I'm waiting on this, to go on speaking about the Spanish flu, as I've seen some people saying, if this COVID-19 was as dangerous as the Spanish flu, I think we would have been seeing, hold on a moment, I think we would have been seeing much more belief in the vaccine. We'd have been seeing a much higher belief ratio in the vaccine. If people were dropping down and dying, you wouldn't have had to convince anyone to take this vaccine. People would have seen the effect of what was happening from not taking the vaccine, and they would have taken it. The problem with this, the problem that genuine question was the declining cases and deaths when the vaccine was introduced. The TNT. So the problem is that this disease, this virus, isn't as obviously dangerous as the Spanish flu. And if you have people who are young, and the reality is this, and this is where lying, gaslighting, withholding data, withholding information worked against many people inside of the healthcare system. Because when you withheld information, and you had people, you were telling people that everyone needed to be vaccinated, and you made it seem like everyone equally needed to be vaccinated, then what you'd be having, I saw where the problem was with my Instagram live. I should be entering back soon. And when you told everyone in the nation, you informed everyone that they are required to be vaccinated. Regardless of their age, they equally need to be vaccinated. Then you'd have a case. Wow. Okay, right. No, don't worry. That was just me. I caused that technical difficulty over on TikTok there. So you'd have a case then by telling everyone they equally need. Exactly. Thank you, J. Chris. That's exactly what happened. So you'd have a case, you're telling everyone they equally needed to be vaccinated. So what eventually happened is that people who are young recognize that when the data actually came out, the need for vaccination from a younger demographic wasn't that high. And then you told people that if we got to 70% vaccination, everyone needs to be vaccinated. If we get to 70% vaccination, then we'd be fine. We would reach herd immunity. Okay, I'm back live over on... Am I back live over on Instagram? I have to start over. I'd have to start over this Instagram live. You all know how Instagram is the ultimate fight down. Normal thing. All right. Good. So I'm back on Instagram. Hope you really stay with the mentality because people are corrupt. Chicken Little, the sky is falling scenario. Exactly. So because some dishonesty was used in the first, in how we spoke about this virus, everyone needs to get vaccinated. If we get to herd immunity, then we'd be fine. And then you heard that herd immunity doesn't really exist for this vaccine. And then, for this virus, sorry. And then you're hearing everyone, regardless of their age, needs to be vaccinated. And then you're hearing if you're under a certain age, the risk is very minimal. I think what you needed to do from the beginning was start off with as clear honesty as possible. The people that need this are particularly the old people. What are my thoughts on having carnival? Are particularly the old people. And here's this thing. I'm going to get a rag because I'm sweating. And here's this reality. Here's this reality. Here's this reality also. Yes. I'm preaching so much I'm sweating. I had to go and get that a little wipe off there, you know. Whew. Heat in the place. All right. Get Nathan in your party. He has links. I don't know about this links in cement or anything of the like. I have no links to cement. I have no links to any cement people. This is all made up by the TikTok chat. All right, welcome back again to the Instagram chat. If you were here before, you may be following what we were talking about. If you were not here before and you may be a little lost now, you can feel free to go subscribe to my YouTube channel, Nathan Springer on YouTube. And most of the lives that we speak about, most of what we speak about on the lives are recorded there, and you can go there and retrieve them. All right. So, where were we? Right. It was some of the dishonesty in the beginning. And when you had that dishonesty, you increased the distrust some people had in the authorities. Many people do not trust the authorities now, and they have good reason not to. If you go through the timeline of this, and there's a lot of gaslighting. Many people use the word gaslighting, but they use it incorrectly. Basically, what gaslighting is lying to you to make you think like you're going crazy. That's kind of what gaslighting is. It's lying to you, making you not believe what you knew happened. Was it dishonesty or lack of knowledge? Here, I am with you there. There is a difference between dishonesty and lack of knowledge. The science and research evolved. I understand that argument and I see that argument, but I am angry that I didn't pull up this evidence before. I can show you threads that go through a timeline, and show you what was known, when it was known, and yet still they said something different. And the dishonesty in it, there may be good reason for the dishonesty. Some people may say that they were holding back some information, they weren't letting out the full information, in order to control the movement of the group. They wanted to, make sure that everyone was doing the right thing, so they were trying to control the information. I don't know how many of you recall early in 2020, the first thing that came out was no masks. I don't know how many of you remembered that. There was an instruction first, no masks. Then an instruction came out, wear masks. Then an instruction came out, one mask isn't enough, you need to double mask. Then an instruction, triple mask. And the truth is, if you look at the research done, there was no change in the research done when they changed from no mask to one mask to double mask to triple mask. There was no change in the research done. If you remember 2020, they started off with a safe social distancing of 6 feet. They changed that to 3 feet. Off of a whim. And there was no change in the research. When they changed that from 6 to 3. There was never any research for the 6 feet in the first place. They just changed that on a whim. And then you're finding out that many of the people making the instructions inside of this are willingly lying about the history of this. They have lied about where it came from. There are emails tracing back to early 2020, someone emailing and saying, do we have any exposure on this? That was a literal email, verbatim. Where did it come from? What happened in the lab? And none of that was released. No information on that was released. Now there's some research on some final areas on the Pfizer vaccine that someone had a FOIA, a Freedom of Information Act request, and they sent it in, and the response to that FOIA was it would take 50-something years before they get the results of that. That's really not necessary. Can you say there was no change in research? There has been constant research. I'm not saying there was no change. And that's part of the problem. When there is change in the research, there is change in research, there's evolving data. You can't be trying to control the data amongst changing data. So what is going to happen here is you'd have given people a small snippet of unfinished data. And now the entirety of the data has changed a bit more. And you already gave them a small snippet of it without giving them the full details of it. And now, when it has changed, you're trying to give them a different snippet. So what could happen is they're seeing that, okay, these two snippets seem like so far apart, there must be a lie somewhere in there. While what it was multiple half-truths given with evolving data. There's change but a bureaucratic approach to notify the public. You saw that the creator of the Pfizer vax is being banned on social media because of his opinions on the vax mandates. He isn't the creator of the Pfizer vax. That's one Robert Malone, I believe. He can legitimately be considered the inventor of mRNA technology. Some people are trying to negate him for different reasons, but the man was the first one to write a paper on the ability of giving mRNA molecules through lipid tissue, through microlipids. He was the first one, I think, in the late 80s to start writing about it. So he was the pioneer and the inventor of this technology. Obviously, what Pfizer is doing is many years later. It was like, think of it like Thomas Edison invented the light bulb, but he didn't make the fluorescent light bulb. He didn't make the halogen light bulb. They did a lot on top of his technology. You need to have some basis for public policy. It will necessarily lag the leading edge of knowledge. He was one of the originators of it, and he has been saying, if there's 3 hours of a podcast you could go listen and see as he outlines certain things that really didn't add up to him in the bureaucratic leaning of this. It seemed like from the very beginning, many within the bureaucracy decided that we were going with the one-size-fits-all approach. We're going to go with the vaccine, and we're going all in on the vaccine. There isn't going to be another option. And I think that would have been part of the problem in it. And by the bureaucratic approach, where they were attempting to have that one single solution, they excised others. There was a time on social media you couldn't mention that. Here are some examples. You couldn't mention at a point in time that, you know about things, the Dark Horse podcast. There was a point in time you couldn't mention that very likely this virus came from the Wuhan lab. That would have gotten you kicked off of social media. There was a point in time you couldn't mention the risks of myocarditis and pericarditis, while it was known since the trial stages that there's increased risk of it. There was a time you couldn't mention that there's an increased risk to young males. I hope YouTube doesn't have a problem with this, because there are still some of these insane rules on social media. There was a time you couldn't mention that there was an increased risk to young males of those heart challenges with the particular mRNA vaccines. And that's true. You see, so if I'm a young male now, if I have a 16-year-old child, and you refuse to tell me that there's an increased risk in young males of a heart condition, Nathan, the problem is that Dr. Malone isn't the only doctor or accredited institution that speak out. That's true. But that's not the problem. The problem isn't that he isn't the only one. The problem is that they're trying to censor him. The right thing to do is negate his points. TikTok just sent a survey about how you feel about, wow. You see, I'm just speaking about this topic and it could get it could get my life disconnected over on TikTok. And that's some of the problem. So if the point I was getting down in, the point I was getting really emotional about here, if I had a 16-year-old child and you told me in the beginning, everyone needs to be vaccinated. Everyone. We must vaccinate everyone in order to get out of this pandemic. And okay, I took your word on it. And I carried my 16-year-old son to be vaccinated. And then, unfortunately, he had one of those negative reactions with his heart. And then I find out after, because what is going to happen is, if that negative situation happens, I'm going to dive into this research. I'm going to go down that rabbit hole. They have been able to negate those concerns raised. That is not true. And if I end up running down this rabbit hole, looking at these things, and then I find out that this information was there. People were saying this since last year, and they were hiding this information. They were blocking people from seeing this information. Then no, anything you tell me, I'm going to be leaning against believing this. Just as someone in the chat said, they've done things that negated this. They've been able to negate that. That is demonstrably not true. They haven't been able to negate you swelling your heart. A 16-year-old who has their heart swollen, you can't just automatically negate something like that. Before you take your son, you could talk to a doctor who would explain the risk. I agree. That's the thing I've been saying from the very beginning. What you said there, Martin M., is what I've been saying. I did a piece months ago. I can't remember exactly how many months ago. And my statement was this: I won't tell anyone to not get vaccinated. That's insane. I won't tell anyone to blanket go and get vaccinated, because I am not your doctor. I don't know your conditions. What I would tell people is speak to your doctor. But that was not what was being said in 2020. And do not gaslight people and make it seem like we had a level view of this entire thing. There wasn't a real push for this. You're just hallucinating this now. People are lying to people in gaslighting now and lying to them in post, and they can go back now in history and see what was said previously. They can see this. You cannot just lie to them and say it wasn't said. Joe Biden in July of 2020 came out. That's the American president, the president of the number one democracy in the world. He came out in July of 2020 and made an announcement. If you get this vaccine, you will not be getting COVID. He said that. Those exact words. So then to tell people now that this wasn't what was being said, no one said this before. Listen, I should upload over on YouTube. I should upload over, because you know, some of those anti-vaxxers, some of the real deep anti-vaxxers, they live on the internet. They scour the internet and they have the proof there. There's a amalgamation. There's what you call those videos where they put all of that together. The word is just slipping me now. There are one of those videos. Guidelines should have been pushed out, right? There was one of those videos that compiled, right? A compilation. They had a compilation video where they compiled all the statements from various doctors on television, all the politicians, the famous doctors, and they showed you them changing their words over time. And you could see that the words that changed didn't change based on new research. So the problem we had was the politicization of a healthcare topic. And then we had healthcare officials, doctors, scientists joining in the politicization of this. Now, some people might not remember some of this because some people aren't as online as everyone else. But over last year, I don't know who remembers the Black Lives Matter protests. That was in the middle of the pandemic. And the same people, some of the same doctors who came out and said that this is the most deadly pandemic, you must do this, you must do that, you must do the other, they came out because it was politically expedient for their political side. They came out and said that the BLM riots and the BLM protests have no real risk of spreading the pandemic. How many of you remember that? Doctors came out in the streets in the middle of the pandemic. And now when you do something like this, and you decrease the trust now people have in you, because the BLM protests, we spoke some about this last night, we're not going to get into that. There's an obvious political angle to this. And now when you go and show yourself that you're willing to bias your science and your medicine based upon politics and political sides, then people are going to look at you, and now everything you say, they are going to evaluate it as a political statement. The amount of politics injected into this is what created the problems we have now. They say you do your own research but label you as an anti-vax if you don't agree with the science. Clappers, bro. Nathan, here is something called the Alzheimer's reaction, and a lot of people body can't withstand it. Even in Trinidad, for the Andrea Barrett murder, thousands march. Agreed. Latest in the CDC reducing quarantine from 10 to 5 days. That one caused a lot of jokes over quite a bit of the technology, over quite a bit of the social media. CDC decided that they're automatically decreasing the amount of days before you return to work from 10 to 5 because there was too much of a struggle on the economy. So if that could happen, people are looking at this and recognizing that this isn't just science. And when you're telling me obey the science, how can I obey the science when I'm seeing, obviously, the science is infused with politics over it? And I'm using a lot of American examples on purpose because it's widely known. A famous statement was that America sneezes and Trinidad catches the cold. What a weird statement to have now. But a lot of the politicization that happened in the US trickled down through the entirety of the world. And because of that, we are facing some of the problems we are facing. So when you have the leader of the American COVID response saying that he is science, and when you criticize me, you criticize science itself. Imagine the kind of arrogance, the size of an ego that you need to have to say something like that. You understand why they lose trust. Now, someone is asking also in the chat, what are my views on Big Pharma in this? And this is another one of the problems. This is what I'm saying. Stop gaslighting people. If you spoke honestly from the jump, a lot of this wouldn't have been where it is now. When you have Big Pharma, for the last 20 years, I am a millennial. I'm within the millennial generation. We grew up as millennials being told by every end of media that we could hear it from, don't trust Big Pharma. Don't trust Big Pharma. Big Pharma is in it for the money. They've been telling us this about cancer drugs. Cancer, which has been killing people also. Cancer is another one of those very sad things that kills a lot of people every year. And I've been told personally by doctors not to trust Big Pharma and the medication they advise for cancer. I've been told by doctors that there are other doctors that give you medication to keep you paying money until you are broke and you still die from the cancer. This has been said by doctors. So we've been told for the last 30, 40 years, don't trust Big Pharma. And then all of a sudden, you come in the year of our Lord 2020 to tell us that Big Pharma, after all those years, all that nonsense they've done, Pfizer, which has the world record for paying out the highest amount in a criminal charge in the United States, you're telling us now that we must fully trust them. That's insane. You cannot come with that narrative and expect people to believe it. It's just not going to work. And then people are watching at this and understanding there is a reality. So people have been trying to beat down the fact that some people have been raising the point about long-term effects. That's a reality. That's a reality. There is a case for long-term effects. There's a case for long-term effects. And this is what I've been trying to push as far as I could. Multiple things can be true at the same time. I don't think the vaccines were created by some one person trying to kill out all people. Worse yet, kill out all the black people. I don't think that is true. But you can't tell people that they have no right to fear long-term effects when obviously there hasn't been enough knowledge on long-term effects. The argument you could make is that the possibility of long-term effects is slimmer than the possibility of getting some serious bad effects from the current COVID virus that you could fall under. That's a plausible reason. You have to weigh the challenge of the possibility of those long-term effects versus the possibility of the short-term direct effects from COVID-19. That's how you speak in that argument. It is more profitable to treat symptoms than cure the disease. Are you saying science and politics are liars? I am not saying that. I'm not saying science and politics are liars. I am saying that there are liars who are scientists and there are many liars who are politicians. Here's part of the reality. And so I heard someone here mention the Dark Horse podcast. The Dark Horse podcast is a podcast run by by two PhD biologists. I've said before, my main study area was biology. So I really like biology. That's my pet. This Dark Horse podcast, run by two PhD biologists, run by two PhD biologists, right? They were pointing out the reality of how science works. And some people who are not within the science industry don't understand this. So you see a scientist and you're thinking, this scientist is an honest person. He wants to see the best science come forward. But you need to understand how scientists make their money. You have to understand how scientists make their money. The scientists make their money through grants. Now, how do the scientists get these grants? They apply for them. A lot of the grants given to the scientists are given by one particular agency in the United States called the NIH. If that sounds familiar to you, the head of the NIH is one Dr. Anthony Fauci, also known as the science himself. The head of the NIH calls himself the science. So, if you're a doctor, if you're a scientist, when I'm saying doctor, PhD doctor, you're a scientist, and you'd like to do some research, in order for you to get funding to do that research, remember, you're not selling this research in a parlor somewhere. No public, the general public isn't coming in and giving you money to do this research. You have to get someone to sponsor that research. So here are the options. You can get a private company, like mostly those pharma companies, to sponsor the research, or you could go ask the NIH to sponsor it. And now, what do you think is going to happen if your research conflicts with the narratives that they are trying to push? And these two PhD biologists on this podcast talk about this constantly. They speak of how science is curtailed in certain directions. Climate change is a prime example. Climate change is real, but if you do some experiments that go along lines that don't line up perfectly with the approved narratives in climate change, all of a sudden you notice your funding has disappeared. And science is a very elitist kind of system. There are few premier scientific journals that publish your findings. And from the moment if you run afoul of Dr. Anthony Fauci, those journals are going to tell you, well, we're not going to publish your studies anymore. And if your studies cannot be published, listen, if I am a scientist, and I do some studies, and I come on a podcast and I tell you about the studies I've done and the conclusions that I've come to, that would not be taken as science, you know. That's true, Martin M. That isn't the case outside of the US totally. It isn't totally the case outside of the US. I'll get to the politicization of the vaccine and the science outside of the US just now. But if you run afoul of that, you have to line up with them. Okay, let me deal with outside the US. Outside the US, we have WHO, the superpower WHO. Now, how many of you remember this bit of history from just last year? One of the directors in the one of the consultants in the WHO, I believe he was, a scientist, a doctor, one of the people we should be believing in this current pandemic, he was having an interview. And the interviewer asked him a question about one country. The country the interviewer asked about was Taiwan. Now, Taiwan is Bacchanal. Taiwan is the home for Bacchanal. The reason Taiwan is Bacchanal is because the Chinese don't recognize Taiwan. The Chinese government believes that Taiwan belongs to China. According to China, their belief is Taiwan who? Taiwan is part of China. If you ask a Chinese official about Taiwan, they would say that China is going well. So this WHO official, I must bring this in. I must bring this in because what is happening is we're seeing the science curtailed by politics. That's the point I'm making. It does belong to them. Ooh, the Chinese would love you, Martin. The Chinese would love you. I don't agree with it belongs to them at all. But the Chinese think so. So an interviewer was asking one of those WHO officials. WHO is supposed to be an international body that deals fairly and neutrally with all countries. They aren't supposed to form alliances. You're a health body. You don't need an alliance with a particular country and with a particular geopolitical worldview. You're supposed to be fair and balanced. Now, when this official was asked about China, he was like, sorry, I didn't hear you. The lady asked him again, you're really breaking up. So she said she'd ask him again, and he was like, nah, let's go on to the next question. It's a civil matter. If it happened here, we would say independent Tobago who. It's not the same thing like that. Okay, let me go through a brief semi-history of that Taiwanese thing. The Chinese Communist Party took over with a revolution in China, and they started murdering people. They started killing people. The former Chinese government, the previous Chinese government, ran away. So what that is like is if, to use a kind of touchy topic, imagine if the Jamaat al-Muslimin succeeded in their coup attempt in 1990. And Mr. Yassin Abu Bakr was the then prime minister. And then the government of A.N.R. Robinson, who was in charge in the 1990s, they fled to Tobago. And wow, that example actually perfectly lines up because Mr. Robinson was originally a Tobagonian, and I believe he was a chief secretary in Tobago also. So that actually lines up pretty perfectly. So when the Jamaat took over in Trinidad and Tobago, they fled to Tobago. And they were running Tobago as an independent country with freedom as their ideals over in Tobago. And now the Jamaat in Trinidad is saying that Tobago is theirs too. And many people around the world are saying that they believe the people in Tobago, the former government of Trinidad and Tobago, those people in Tobago should be given the right to determine their own future. It shouldn't be up to this dictatorship that took over the entire country to determine what happens to these free people. If they do not want the dictators to rule their country, it should be up to them. It should be up to them. And to say it's just a civil matter is so cruel. To say it's just a civil matter is so cruel. It doesn't work that it doesn't change the fact that Tobago was a part of Trinidad. Tobago would have been a part of Trinidad and Tobago when it existed as it did before. You have to understand how countries were created. You have to understand how countries were created. There were several parts of many countries that weren't parts and then added and then taken away and then added and then taken away. You can't say now, it's not like Italy. Rome in Italy can come up and say now, well, England was once part of Rome, so we have a right to declare that the United Kingdom and the English island must return to the Roman Empire. We would like to reconstitute the Roman Empire, and now we must recapture the entirety of Northern Africa, all of Europe and England also. It's not about suddenly recognizing countries. This was the original government. It was the original government. It's not suddenly recognizing a country. It was the original government of the entire country of China. A coup happened, a revolution, if you will. A dictatorship took over, and they took hold of one of the islands. I don't see it as being anywhere near a sensible statement to say that we would now give ownership of this island where the people don't want to go back to this dictatorship. We would now give dictatorship because of some obscure history that the Communist Party was not a part of. The Communist Party was not a part of the joint Chinese history. It's not like you're giving it back to the Han Dynasty or the Ming Dynasty. You're now giving it back to the Communist Party. You're giving it back to the Communist Party. That can't be said. So, this argument that we're having is a political argument. And I think the WHO has no place in a political argument. If the majority of the world already recognizes Taiwan, and here's how this determines our healthcare. To go back to the original point, the original point of this. Here how this is a detriment to our healthcare. This WHO, because of their alliance with China, Taiwan was one of the first countries to experience COVID-19. And because they didn't trust China, they didn't take the Chinese word, because the Chinese were giving some information on what they were experiencing and the knowledge they gained on COVID-19. And they were lying. And because the Taiwanese didn't trust the Chinese in the first place, they had some of the best first information on COVID. But because the WHO is in the pockets of China and the Communist Party in China, the dictatorship that murders their own citizens, because that is the case, the WHO didn't take information from Taiwan that would have been able to give us a good head start on this entire pandemic. And that's how politicization inside of the healthcare system destroys the healthcare system. And then if you're telling me now that I must take the WHO's word as law, that doesn't make sense to me, because I know that the WHO could change the truth if China says that they have to change the truth. If the case is that something comes out that incriminates China but gives us a revelation that would help us handle this pandemic, I cannot trust the WHO to give me that information. Hey, I now notice that the viewers skying up to 75. Thank you all for joining in. I cannot trust that the WHO would give me accurate information on that, because they are in the pockets of a dictatorship. Exactly as someone said it here, they have a conflict of interest. I cannot trust their view as being a neutral one. If they did indeed stay out of the geopolitics, I'll be fine with that. If when the question of Taiwan came up, they said, we have no comment on the geopolitics of any region, that's fine by me. And when the question of the science and the health in Taiwan came up, they could have spoken about the actual data that came out from Taiwanese scientists fairly, then that would have been fair to me. But that's not what they did. They didn't stay out of it. They went into it and chose a side in it. And if you have a group choosing a side in this, it's not going to work. It's just not going to work. I'd as well study these people. What is it that... All right, let's see what's in the chat. Not much words in the chat. Wow, we're streaming now on YouTube for an hour and 30 minutes. That's very long for my YouTube. What would I do in that scenario as who the WHO? How come the only time the issue of trust came about is with COVID? Is that so? Is that the only time the issue of trust came about? Would I ever consider getting into politics? Not partisan politics, I think. I don't think I'd ever get into partisan politics, because I don't think it works at what it's aiming at doing. I don't think it's successful at doing that. Someone asked, how come the only time the issue of trust came about is with COVID? That's not true. That's not the only time the issue of trust came about. The issue of trust was always there. But what COVID brought up was the reality that some of these people you do not trust have a lot of sway over your everyday life. If no one attempted to make anyone do anything, then the trust issue wouldn't have been relevant. But now you're recognizing that some of these people do have quite a lot of say on what happens with your life. So then the issue of trust comes about. It's like, think of it, if you distrust the UNC party in Trinidad and Tobago, as you probably should with nearly any politician, and you find out now that the UNC has a sway over the CMO. If you find out now that the CMO in our country is swaying and holding information based on what the UNC says, and he holds back some information or gives some more information based upon what the UNC tells him to do. If you knew that all along, that would be fine. But then if you find out that the CMO has some sway on decision making in the country, it starts to get very worrying. The WHO is also funded by the Gates Foundation. The Gates are major shareholders in Pfizer and also. That's also true. The erosion of trust is a tragedy that has made governing almost impossible. Not good. That statement I fully agree with. I fully agree with the statement that the lack of trust has made governing nearly impossible. Nearly. I don't think we should have a minister, to be honest. It should be an independent body like the police. The problem is, how do you find an independent body? It's easy to say an independent body, but it's not that easy to find an independent body. And how well has our current police service been working? I could tell you, I am not sure I would have wanted our police service running our pandemic efforts. I'm not sure I'd have wanted that anyway. The lack of trust, though, as someone rightfully pointed out, has made governing an extremely difficult thing. It has made the entire process of governing a pleading case. And here's where some of that just goes off the rails to me. It goes off the rails to me because you have this already lack of trust in the government. And then, to me, I don't see most of the world's governments doing much things to increase that trust. If you look at some of the countries that are having some of the best results, look at Iceland, look at Sweden. Part of the issue now, standing order 41. Part of the issue now, you have to bear in mind, you have to keep the reality. Part of the issue is homogeneity. What that means is if you have a lot of the same people with the same beliefs who look alike, have the same history in the same place, it's a much easier place to run because they have a similar worldview. So, for example, right now, one of the articles I had up was the fact that the Mahasabha now is pleading with the government to reopen the rivers. They would like the rivers and water places reopened because they have religious ceremonies that take place there, and they would like that done. Now, in a country where you have that mix of multiple religions, that's an issue that our government has to face. But if you were in a country where everyone believed the same thing, that very likely wouldn't have been an issue. Or if you're in a country where everyone believed in Hinduism and that was real, then very likely you would have been able to close all the rivers but still allow that ceremony to go on, and it would have worked fine. But multiculturalism adds to the difficulty. And now when you add the fact of multiculturalism plus the distrust in authority, it makes really hard governing. It makes for really, really hard governing. The Mahasabha is promising that they won't use the rivers and the waterways for limes. They have religious ceremonies that necessitate it. Now, if you are in a religion that requires you to do part of the rites by a river, is it religious discrimination for the government to insist that you cannot do it? Is it? It may very well be. It may very well be. And then we are going to fall into the issue of we're reaching the point where the government could determine the limitations of someone's religion. And the government could determine the limitations of someone's religion based upon their own personal belief in safety. So if the government determines that something is unsafe, they could make an action that prejudices against one specific religion. It's like some of the discrimination cases that have been won. If some of the discrimination cases that have been won already by Rastafarians, if the government says that Rastafarian hair and hairstyle has a negative effect on some healthcare. I was going to draw an example, but I think I might put myself in trouble there. If that is the case, and the government then bans the Rastafarian hairstyle because there's some healthcare difficulty with it, would that be okay? That's where we're leading from this. If there was a lice epidemic, I'm sorry if this offends any of my Rasta brethren. It's not the intention. But if there was a lice epidemic, a lice pandemic that broke out, would we be okay with the government mandating the shaving of all Rastafarians here? And these are the issues that arise in a multicultural society, as I said. So if you look at some of those societies like Iceland and those Scandinavian countries, they handle the pandemic much better than many of the others because they were able to get a lot of the things done easier. And in countries like Iceland, they were brutally open with all the data. Nearly all the data was just put into the whatever it was into a collection thing, and nearly all of the civilians could have viewed nearly all of the data. I think personally, if we want to return to some semblance of trust, that's what we need. We need as much openness as we can with the data. It's past the time where you're trying to limit data, you're trying to limit some people finding some things out. It's way past that time. Now is the time you expose all the data. Sunlight is the best remedy. All the data, the good, the bad, the ugly, expose it. That way, you can attempt to build up some of the trust. That's the only thing I could see as working now. I don't even think many of those mandates would work because we're already in the stage where some distrust has already happened. So even if you lean into some of those mandates, these people don't trust you. So if you're forcing people who don't trust you, they're only going to trust you less, and you're going to end up in some difficulties. And some countries are seeing some of those difficulties already. We are seeing some protests, some violent protests even coming from the pushing of some of these mandates. Now, I'm not saying that I predict that for Trinidad and Tobago. Honestly, I think even if the government were to institute a mandate in Trinidad and Tobago, we won't see the level of violent protests many of the other countries get because, as I've repeatedly said, violent protests generally are determined by how uncomfortable you are. And if you are very comfortable in Trinidad and Tobago, generally speaking, we ain't going out in no road and draw no violent protests. Should everyone be vaccinated for us to return to normal? What are your thoughts? With that freedom of information, the authorities' ability to manipulate the narrative is eroded. Well, I'd love that. I don't think there should be a narrative that is being manipulated. What is the truth should be the narrative. The truth is the narrative. I don't think there should be a narrative manipulated. Give us the information. Do I believe everyone should be vaccinated to return to normal? No. I don't think if everyone is vaccinated, we would even return to normal. There has already been proof of that. There are some countries over 90% vaccinated. There are some universities in the United States. This is insane to me. Harvard, Stanford, some of those most premier universities have 100% vaccination rates. They have mandated the booster shot on their young students. They have 100% vaccination with booster. And they have still locked down their campuses and returned to online schooling. So getting everyone vaccinated isn't a sure way out of this pandemic, and it shouldn't be looked to with that intention. Vaccination is not a way out of the pandemic. The way, what vaccination is a way to protect yourself. Vaccination is about you. It is about you. Like a bad relationship break trust, there will be chaos. Vaccination is about you. If you'd like to protect yourself, if you are obese particularly, if you are hypertensive particularly, if you are diabetic particularly, it's a way to protect you. It's a sure way to not crash your healthcare system. That's true. That's also true, especially with the limited healthcare system we have. Maldives has 100% vaccination and had to lock down for Christmas. Bottom line is government needs to respect personal choice. Both vaccinated and unvaccinated can get it. But what are the ICUs? That's exactly the point, Empress Roni. That is the point of the vaccination. The point of the vaccine is to protect you from serious illness. If you are vaccinated, generally speaking, the evidence still stands. The evidence, to me, this is the clearest evidence, and I'm yet to see an anti-vaxxer who could really convince me of otherwise. It seems clear to me that the vaccines do decrease your risk of getting severely ill and of dying. That seems pretty clear. How much it will could possibly be up to debate. Whether that means you should force everyone to be vaccinated or not, I don't think so. But it does increase your safety. All right. We have nothing else to get us out of this. There is nothing to get us out of this. It's a pandemic. The pandemic passes through. We're aiming at the biological end of this pandemic. We're aiming that People, many people seem to have forgotten what has been said from the very beginning. I remember some biologists came out in the very beginning and said the natural cycle of a pandemic. They explained this already. What we expect to see and how we expect to get out of this. Variants. Remember, the Spanish flu, the deadly Spanish flu, is basically still around. Every year people get it. But it now has mutated enough that it has rendered itself not that much of a danger. Seatbelts save lives, but accidents still happen. If someone don't want the protection, don't force them if they get seriously ill. We eradicated polio with vaccines, so why not this? Because polio isn't the same thing as this. Polio is not the same thing as this. We are not going to eradicate this with vaccines. One problem is there are animal reservoirs for this. I was reading an article just today that there was an outbreak of COVID in the deer population. So even if you could have vaccinated all humans, the virus may circle in an animal, mutate in that animal, and jump back into humans. The issue isn't about eradicating the virus. And the countries that have tried it have done damage, irreparable in some cases, to their social fabric. You cannot reach down to COVID zero. COVID zero is an impossible policy. Omicron seems like the first real step towards COVID becoming less damaging. Go, if you'd like to see COVID, very likely. Think of it this way. There are still coronaviruses from thousands, even possibly, as some may have it, million years ago. So the intention is, and if you want hopeful news about how we exit this pandemic, if you want hopeful news, go read some news from South Africa. South Africa has removed their state of emergency. They have lifted curfews. They are saying that their Omicron spike was not that bad, and there's some promise showing that this may very well be a possible silver lining and escape from the pandemic. So eventually, how we get out of this is learning to live with it, hopefully getting decreased danger variant that passes around. People get immune enough and they don't get badly ill. It have about 7 types of COVID that affect humans. When you say COVID, you mean coronaviruses, I presume. If we can slow the variants, we can get treatment and wide effect vaccines. That's not going to happen. We are not going to slow the variants. We are not going to slow the variants because in order to do that, you need to vaccinate the entire world. And we have places, where was it? Norway, they approved 6 shots, I believe, while places have below 6% vaccination in some places in Africa. It's a global virus, and the globe isn't going to become 100% vaccinated. That is a pipe dream. And to clamp down the world, to lock down the world with the lie that somehow we are going to 100% vaccinate the world is insanity. And even if we did 100% vaccinate the world, it's not going to stamp out the existence of variants. And variants may very well still jump out from among this vaccinated population. They are researching vaccines that could address multiple variants plus longer lasting vaccine. They have a vaccine for Delta. How many of you know this? They have a vaccine for Delta already. And Pfizer's announcing within 3 months they'll have a vaccine for Omicron. They are creating vaccines for each one of the variants. But that isn't the problem. The problem is the variants are escaping, the vaccines are leaky, and the mRNA technology has seemed to have shown that they cannot create a vaccine with 100% efficacy. And if you have the case where the virus is spreading just as frequently among vaccinated people as unvaccinated people, that also allows for the possibility of mutation. So even if everyone is vaccinated, I don't think variants are going to disappear. Vaccination is not the way out of this pandemic in general. The vaccination is the way out of the hospital and out of danger for yourself. I don't know what my opinions are on the pills from Merck. They are showing some promise, but we'll see when it actually hits the market. All right. I've been going for really long, and I'm going to come off of the YouTube live. For all of those who are still over there holding on the YouTube live. Wow, there were four of you. Thank you for tuning in, and I now bid you good.